Hey guys, this is Dragon Ball for Life here today, and I'm back with another video. Now, today's video, we're going to react to Life and Stock Media's video called Did Dragon Ball Z Switch Timelines? Now, I'm assuming this video is going to be basically talking about, from the Cell Saga where Trunks came from the future to the past to change what's going to happen in the future, but we found out that that's not how time traveling works in Dragon Ball. The way it works in Dragon Ball is when you go back in time, you're not affecting the future at all. It basically creates a branch in the timeline, and whatever effects happen, in the past only affect that timeline, and the other timeline that the person came from, it has no effect on it. And we saw that with, Trunks' future not really being changed, and he was able to beat Android 18 and 17, by coming to the past, but the reason that he was able to beat them wasn't because he went to the past and was changing effects there. It was just that he basically got helped by them. But yeah, that created a separate timeline. Now, from what we've seen throughout, Dragon Ball Z, and especially Dragon Ball Super, there's countless other timelines out there. We don't know how many. We just know that there's quite a bit, and we know Trunks has definitely contributed to it. There are a lot more that was shown in Dragon Ball Super, where we go into the room where Gowasu is showing it to Zamasu, the time ring, and there's these four other green ones, and he was like, what are these? He said, well, they're basically ones, every time that, somebody messes with time, it creates a new branch in the timeline. These green ones are created, and there was four of them in the box, and there was countless other boxes throughout the entire room. So from that, we can all assume that, there's countless other times people have went through time and created other branches of timelines. So in each of those cases could be like 4 to 5 different timelines, representations of timelines throughout those boxes. So there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of different, branches of timelines. So there's more than just the one or two, or maybe I think it was like 3 or 4 that they set up in the Cell Saga. So there's going to be quite a bit into it, but I think he's going to mainly talk about, Trunks' timeline. Maybe the timeline that Cell came from, because he came from a different timeline, but it was from the future there. I think that was kind of a plot hole, maybe, because it is a little bit confusing. It could either be his, or just, the regular one. And I think he's going to be mainly focusing on Trunks' one, where he came back into the past, which created the departure between the two. So whatever direction he's going to go in. I do know that there's far more intricacies to this topic and idea, but it just can get very, it can get very hard to, keep pace with it, and sometimes can be hard to understand because it is complex. Manipulating time in reality, it's not very plausible, but even if it is very complex, and even, scientists that, know this stuff and study and, are very smart, they themselves are also confused. So us as regular people are not going to really be getting it that easily either. So it makes sense. So yeah, let's get into it.
Hey guys, it's Mike here, and over the course of my time in the Dragon Ball fandom, I've heard of a number of different theories. Many of these theories have to do with in-universe mechanics, how things work, and how the greater in-universe story unfolds. However, every now and then, I'll hear a really interesting theory that has to do with the narrative itself. And one such theory is what I'm going to be talking about in this video, which is something that has to do with the timelines, or more specifically, the ones that we observe throughout the story. And that is, did the Dragon Ball story switch timelines during Dragon Ball Z, more specifically during the Cell Saga? And also, if it did, what are the ramifications not just on that arc, but every other arc moving forward? Well, let's get into that right now. So this theory proposes that up until the point of the Frieza arc, and really everything before that, everything is taking place in one timeline. The original timeline in this case. Because for all we know, every single thing that occurs up until the point of the Cell Saga's beginning is the same in the main timeline as it was in the original and every other timeline. It really begins to diverge when we get into the actual events of the Cell Saga. And to give more of an explanation as to how the time travel basically works for people who might not be aware, basically we're explained this by Trunks, Gohan, and some of the others when they're speculating about time travel during the Cell arc. More specifically, Trunks brings up the idea of, how about this? I go further into the past with my time machine and destroy the androids before they're activated. We know where Dr. Gero's lab is now. And then of course, Yamcha's saying that he thinks it'll work. At this point, Krillin intervenes and he says, "Wait, didn't you say the time machine isn't perfect? And Goku told me it takes a long time to charge it for the trip and back. Will you be able to get back to the future after going further in the past? I don't know." So, of course, Trunks came from his own timeline to the past, quote unquote, which is really the past of another timeline that was created by time travel. By who is what I'll get into shortly. At this point, Gohan intervenes in the conversation. He says, I was thinking, if Trunks does go to the past and destroys the androids, what's going to happen to the androids in the present? Are they going to disappear? And then Trunks says, oh, that's right. The future of that timeline would be saved from the androids, but there would be no change in this timeline where the androids already exist. Krillin says, what do you mean? Okay, for example, says Trunks, your Goku's life was saved by the medicine I brought from the future, but in my timeline, Goku still died from this virus. In other words, there's both a future in which Goku has died and one in which he has lived. Kind of almost like Schrodinger's cat or the kind of quantum ideas. And one in which he lived, as I said. Each change in the past creates new futures. Wait a second, then even if Goku defeats the androids here, wouldn't they still exist in your future? That's right. Yamcha asks, then what was the point of you coming to the past? Your future isn't going to change. And then Trunks says, Mom said it's so horrible what the androids did to us that there deserves to be a peaceful future where they've been destroyed. But also, maybe I could find their weakness by watching Goku fight them. And if that didn't work, then maybe we could bring Goku to our future with the time machine. But I've come to a past that's slightly different from the one I knew. The timing of Goku's illness was different. There are 3 androids, and they're much, much stronger. If they really are, well, I speculated on that in another video you could see on my channel. But why is it different? I don't know. What changed? Is it because I used the time machine before? And so this basically explains.
Okay, I wanted to pause right there because there's quite a bit of interesting stuff that was explained there. Now, I've mentioned this countless times before, but there's mainly 2 ways to, manipulate, like time traveling works. Now, there's the time traveling that we see conventionally in many forms of media, mainly, Terminator, where if you go back to the past, it doesn't create a branch of a timeline, it's just that timeline, there's one, and when you go in the past, whatever effects you do in the past will change the future, whether it's good or bad, there's going to be effects there no matter what. So when going to the past, and if you change stuff, it's going to change the future, and that's usually akin to the the butterfly effect. Whereas in the alternate timelines one, whatever you do in the past will not affect your future; it'll only affect that future. It'll basically mean that time could be linear, but as soon as you travel back in time or even forward in time, you will be branching off that. So it will go from linear to a branch like a tree. So that's like the 2 types that they have, and there has been other fictional works of works of fiction where we've seen where they've done the branch timeline, but I think that they followed the butterfly effect, whereas the branch out timeline they rarely do that. So I do like the fact that the Dragon Ball did it that way. I think it's a lot more cooler, if I'm being honest, to have alternate timelines. But the thing about that is, it was kind of weird because in Super we had the whole conversation between Whis explaining to them the butterfly effect, and that works, but that doesn't work in Dragon Ball because that's not how time works in Dragon Ball. So I don't know why he explained that in Dragon Ball Super. Did Toriyama or Toei, whoever wrote that, forget that that's how time works there? Because they did explain it a little bit afterwards, but it was pointless for Whis to go throughout that whole explanation. It did kind of make no sense because you would think Whis and Beerus would know something about time traveling, even though they haven't messed with it. You would think that the fact that Omni King put it as a law to go through time is bad, that they would know at least some stuff about how time actually works. But also the fact that Trunks suggested going back even further into the past to wipe out the androids, but then also himself mentioning that, whatever you do, it won't affect the future. Then why would you suggest that? It makes no sense. He's shown that it's not like he newly discovered that. He already knew that, but he made that suggestion. So it was pointless to make that suggestion in the first place. Also, I never caught this when I watched Dragon Ball, but I thought that he figured this out only when only when he saw that there was no change in his future. I thought he only realized it then, but apparently Bulma and him already knew it beforehand, and she just said, hey, let's at least help out another timeline if we can't help out ours, or at least we can get some help from there, which I feel like is a big thing to do, and it's crazy to mess with time or, timelines simply to do that if it's not going to change your time anyway. So it's weird in that case. But the fact that Trunks already knew that but never mentioned this, or until then, it just seems a little weird and odd to me, especially when he made the suggestion of going back in the time and destroying them before the labs. Like, well, you know how time works here. If you did that, it would have no effect on that. You just create another separate timeline, and it'll be pointless. So why you keep on doing this and wasting additional, time fuel, which is very, hard to get by. So that's a little weird there. Though I do want to ask you guys this question: would you guys like to see like a story of, the whole Cell Saga, Android Saga, where time works like how it works, with the butterfly effect and, Terminator, where there isn't an alternate timeline, it just affects that. Like, let's say Trunks goes back in the past, gives them the future, the medicine in the past, and by doing so, it changes his future where, Goku's alive. Would you want to see some cool story about that? Because I've seen a lot of these, people, like, there's fans that make fan-made mangas of these like other stuff. They could do one on that, where they simply have them going have it where the butterfly effect is how time works instead of alternate timelines. That would be kind of cool. But yeah, it's a little confusing, it's a little complex, but it is still dumb to me that Trunks already knew that, but then still suggested that. And then also they just mentioned it now. And then, his mom made such a big, they went so far to do that just so he could, go back and, time. You would think with her intelligence, she would try to find a way to find an off button or a destruction button or something else herself. That I'm pretty sure they're making it sound like it's harder to make a remote control to destroy these guys than it is to make a time machine with time field to go back in the past. That's crazy to me. You can make a time machine easily, but not a remote to shut them down or destroy them. That's just ridiculous to me. But let's get back into it. I want to hear more about what he says, because there's quite a bit of stuff I want to talk about when it comes to this time manipulation stuff in the story.
Means that in Dragon Ball, the way that time travel works in its own in-universe way is basically that there was one timeline initially, and then Trunks, the original future Trunks from the true original timeline, went back in time after the androids wiped everyone out and Goku had died of the heart virus. At that point, when he went to the past, just because he was present in the past now, that's a change from the original timeline, which means that he created a new timeline. That was the unseen timeline, not the main one that we're looking at right now. The main timeline and all these other changes that Trunks are talking about actually was created 1 year before this Trunks went back in time. And by who, you may ask? Well, right here is when we get the explanation. The other time machine arrived a year before, and who is the one that was piloting it? None other than Cell. And Cell even goes on to explain more about this when he's in his showdown with Piccolo, and he starts to discuss what exactly occurred, where he says that not only is he an android, that he sent himself and the machine was too small, that's why he reverted back to his larval state, but when he actually got here, he said, and he explains in depth how the change occurred, that not only did they borrow the cells from everyone in order to create him, but he says here that in terms of when he went back in time, Piccolo asked him, but why did it take 3 years after you came back to this time? 3 years as a nymph beneath the earth. That's what took so long for me to mature from an egg. And then one last question. Why did you come here from the future? What's the point? And this is the point where he explains in depth that he wanted to collect the androids, absorb them so that he could become perfect because they didn't exist in that future. And then he says, but why did you choose 3 years ago? I didn't. Trunks had pre-programmed the machine to that year, and I just pushed the button. At this point, Piccolo speculates that he was coming back to tell them that he destroyed the androids, but the thing is that Cell actually went back a year before Trunks ever arrived, which would have been before Trunks had introduced himself to Goku and the others, so none of them ever would have known that he was going back in time, which you can say is a plot hole. I talked about that in other videos on my channel. Nonetheless, the point is, because Cell...
Okay, yeah, that is a plot hole because if he said 3 years back, then he should have been before Trunks. It should have been after Trunks, and then wiped out what happened there. But here's the thing about this: they do mention that this timeline got affected and it changed, and that the change what happened made Android 17 and 18 stronger than in Trunks' timeline. But it doesn't really make any sense. Yes, did Cell, even ignoring the whole plot hole there? There's another plot hole. There's another plot hole. I'll talk about that later. But it doesn't make sense for 17 and 18 in their timeline to get stronger. Like, what major change happened there? Maybe you could say maybe what's the thing called? Trunks giving the Saiyans, or I mean not Saiyans, the Z Fighters a heads up, basically made them go pursue Dr. Gero, which made force his hand to let them out earlier or whatever. But why would that make them stronger? I know he had an inhibitor that lowered their power so he can have more control over them, but in the future timeline, I'm pretty sure them coming after the androids, at least 19 and 20, wouldn't have been that late after, even if like Trunks didn't warn them. I'm pretty sure they would have noticed that there's mass destruction happening on island. They would have came, so they probably would have came there a little bit delayed and a little bit later, but they still would have came in at that time and would have forced him to unleash them. Maybe there's something happening there. From what they were showcasing in this show, it was that they're like suggesting that Cell going back in the time did the change, but how? Because Cell wasn't known by Dr. Gero. The Z Fighters didn't know him only until after they were released. So how did they become stronger by him going back in the past? That doesn't really affect anything. Also, it makes no sense that he came from Trunks' future where he's in the past, because if we're going based off of Trunks' timeline, which is the main timeline, and his effects of him going back in the time past only affected that timeline, the original timeline that we were looking through. If it only affected that, how did Cell come from another future? Because that would be a separate branch. That would mean that there would be 3 separate branches, but there wasn't. There was only 2 until Cell went back to create the third one. But he wouldn't be able to create the third, branch in the timeline because the events of, future Trunks didn't end yet because he was still there. So it makes no sense there. I think that's also kind of a retcon in my eyes that, because it was one thing of like, let's say that Trunks and them already defeated the androids and he went to the future and then he did that and then he went back to the past. But then it's like, see, I know some of you guys are getting a little confused. I'm confused myself. Maybe it's just, Toriyama not thinking carefully and making some mistakes, because he did have the editors on his ass about his decision making. He first made Android 19 and 20 as the main guys, and the editors like, why are you having an old man and an overweight robot? And he's like, okay, I'll make this 17 and 18. And then he was like, why do we have some teenage looking punks? And then he's like, okay, I'll have Cell. And he's like, Cell looks ugly. And then he had to keep on changing it to make him better. And this did change it a lot. So I think the editor did improve the the arc as a whole, but I think his input also kind of probably screwed up Toriyama, knowing very well Toriyama's kind of like forgetful. So he probably didn't think it thoroughly, but from what I'm looking at, it doesn't make sense. How could, Cell come from a future timeline where there, unless Trunks made another, era where he went into the future? There's no way he could do that. The only way that Cell could go back is if he killed that specific specific Trunks, but he didn't. He killed another Trunks from another timeline, but there can't be another timeline until this Trunks has made an effect there. So what I'm saying is basically, what would have happened they would have to destroy 17 and 18. Trunks would be like, okay, I'm done, go back to his future, kill them, and then Cell coming in and saying, hey, they're wiped out, let me kill this Trunks, so this Trunks would have been dead, and then went back, and then that would have been just still 2 timelines. So he would have gone back into the past, or maybe 3, since he would have gone even further if it was canonically correct, and he went back further, then he would have made a third. But that would have mean that their Trunks would be dead, and there wouldn't be a second Trunks that is dead, and that one Trunks is dead and there's another future Trunks that's alive. There would have just been one Trunks that's dead. So that doesn't really make sense. But time traveling is very confusing, and like I said, the editor thing might have also messed him up. Even scientists who do quantum physics and quantum mechanics are also baffled when it comes to time traveling. So I'm not surprised a mangaka would also be a little confused. Also, if I'm being honest, I hate time traveling stories. it can be kind of fun in a sci-fi way, but it's a little overdone at this point. It's a little bit redundant, and it's a little convoluted in the way. No matter if you're doing a butterfly effect or an alternate timeline thing, it's really confusing, and it's just lazy and kind of dumb at this point. And I wish that future storylines of any show, especially Dragon Ball, steer clear away from time traveling, because it does get a little bit messy when you try to think of it thoroughly. So yeah, let's get back into it.
Went back 1 year before Trunks did, Cell created a new timeline, which was the main timeline, circumventing the other timeline that Trunks had created and the earlier point in the history of Trunks, as well as those other timelines. So he created this one and inadvertently also created the other Trunks timeline, because of the fact that this Trunks went back to the timeline that Cell had already changed, which in turn meant that this new Trunks, would have his timeline changed, and he wouldn't eventually go on and be killed by Cell. So that's the in-universe mechanics. We know for a fact that there are at least 4 timelines in Dragon Ball Z because of this. However, what ends up happening in terms of the narrative is that when Trunks arrives from the future to fight Frieza, which we'll see momentarily when I get to that. Right now, Frieza and his father show up, one of the most wasted potential characters in the franchise I talked about plenty of times on my channel, and then Trunks shows up, and he's ready to kill Frieza, and he actually does that because Trunks doesn't mess around. He wipes people out, chops them up, blows them away. King Cold thinks he could win just because he has a sword. Not quite, and then he gets blown away too. So you can even see his tail left over after he gets disintegrated. And maybe that's where the cells came from for Cell. Guess you weren't that thorough, Trunks. But nonetheless, the idea that what actually happened, and according to the topic of this video, is that for the entire story up until this moment, we actually were following the original timeline. However, what actually happens is that when we switch over to this chapter, it actually now switches over to another timeline, the main timeline. In other words, what this means is that the Trunks that we see here is also a duplicate. You could argue that maybe we're following the history of Trunks timeline, but nonetheless, we know that this Trunks is not the original Trunks. However, we also know that none of these characters, Frieza, King Cold, or even the Earthlings that are watching everything go down, are actually the real ones that we were following the entire story. That's what this theory proposes. Every single character that we follow from the Cell Saga onward is actually a duplicate of the characters that we grew to know and love over the course of the story up until Namek, which means that Vegeta, Tien, Krillin, Chaozu, Gohan, Piccolo, everyone in here, and Goku, and every single person that we see throughout the course of the franchise after this point, other than when we go to the history of Trunks' future and stuff, are, in fact, different versions of these characters. They're duplicates. They're strangers in a sense. They are not the ones that we actually followed the entire time. They are themselves timeline variants, which means that the real characters that we actually followed up until this point are all dead and gone. Every single one of them got killed by the androids. Goku died of the heart virus, or, they might have eventually even been wiped out by Zeno in Dragon Ball Super. So as a result, every single character we followed in the original franchise no longer exists potentially, and had a very dark outcome that we never even saw happen on screen, with the exception of the history of Trunks, which itself was a duplicate of the original timeline, which is where Cell came from.
Okay, so that would mean that technically that the darkest timeline in Dragon Ball is the original timeline. So the original timeline is the most fun. It's kind of like Rick and Morty, where they left their own universe and they had the whole manipulation stuff. But yeah, that's kind of crazy to me to think, because people always like, oh, Dragon Ball's lighthearted, which is like, and sometimes it is, but they have some really dark themes. Let's be honest. It's not like obviously like Berserk where it's 24/7 dark, but it's like there's difference of writing. There's writing where you have dark moments. There's goofy moments, but when the dark moments hit, it makes it even more serious. So that's the thing I like about Dragon Ball. when it comes to that. But that technically means that the original timeline is the darkest timeline, which it doesn't actually also make any sense, like I explained, because that timeline should not be created, or at least the events of them fighting in, perfect Cell. Because even if Cell came back, he would have been just in a semi-perfect form, because Android, for him to actually do that, because he went from the future time, somehow he came in even future Trunks, even more of a future Trunks timeline. The only way for him to do that is for them to have killed 17 and 18 with Trunks' help, and then Trunks going back to the future, killing his 17 and 18, just Cell coming out and saying, hey, they're all dead, killing Trunks, and then going back to the past. So technically there shouldn't be that many an additional timeline, logically speaking. But even with that, that basically means that the original timeline is the darkest timeline. That is the timeline where basically all the heroes died. Even Trunks got killed off by Cell. It was just that Cell fucked off and left. But who knows what happened afterwards. Babidi, he couldn't really come to Earth, because I'm pretty sure... actually, Babidi could come to Earth, but do you think he could collect enough energy to revive Majin Buu? I don't think so. I think... but then again, it's like... Even if he doesn't have enough energy to revive Majin Buu, I'm pretty sure he could take a decent amount, because he was even willing to, you could revive him even with a low amount, but even at his weakest, he should be able to wipe out. So who knows? I would love to see a storyline where, where Toriyama does like a spin-off where we see the other timelines and what effect happened. Because we saw Trunks' timeline, what happened with the explanation on how he handled the Boost situation, and then Goku Black there. But I want to see how it would happen with the original timeline, because technically all the superpowered beings are killed off. Goku, the rest of the Z Fighters are killed off. Gohan died, and even Trunks died. That means that, the only characters that we know from the original that are left would be Yajirobe, from what we've seen in, the future Trunks timeline, and in the Goku Black arc and Super. Him, Bulma, and Chi-Chi would be the only ones left alive. Everybody else would have been dead in that original timeline, which is kind of crazy in my opinion, if you think about it. But that happens, then what would happen with the Boost situation? What would happen with Beerus? I don't think Beerus would come out or, even care about it, unless maybe, let's say, Android 17 and 18, they wipe out all... Well, actually, no, they would be dead then. So I don't know what would happen. The only thing I can see is, Babidi being like, damn, I don't have enough, energy, because most of the population has been wiped out, and there's no real powerful superpowered beings. He brings them out probably with like only a bit of his energy, but he will be still pretty strong enough. And who knows, maybe Beerus might wake up and end up killing Boo, or Goku Black might come in and wipe out the rest and finish it. But no, if Goku Black did come out, then actually, I don't know. It's kind of confusing. The reason why I'm saying that is because I was going to say, if Goku Black did come, in that timeline, the original timeline, remember his thing was to wipe out all life from all timelines, just basically from all existence. He was trying to wipe out all mortals, just leave gods and the universe intact. Then he would have came there already. But I do remember Beerus wiped out Goku Zamasu and Goku Blacks. The only ones that weren't affected was the one that with the time ring. But after that, after he beat him, he wiped out all the Zamasus by using the Hakai technique. So that would mean that none of them there. I don't know what will happen, but that would be considered technically the darkest timeline. And then the second closest would be, the Future Trunks timeline, which would be the second kind of main timeline, which is the second darkest timeline. And then we have, the timeline that we're in, which isn't the darkest, but it does have some dark moments. But then again, so yeah, that would be pretty interesting. It's pretty cool to think about, how that timeline would look like, and the events that would unfold. I would like to see what would happen there. So yeah, the thought of it is quite interesting, but like I said, it's just showcased there's different darkness to it, but like I said, it's kind of, I don't like it because now we're saying, oh, well, this is not the main timeline was this and that. So I don't like time traveling. I do prefer the alternative timelines more than just going back in the past and then change the future. The butterfly effect, I'm kind of feel like it's overdone and outplayed, and I think it's kind of lazier way of writing, but yeah, I still don't like time traveling as a whole. I think it creates stuff like this where now we're like, well, this is not the original timeline anymore, so it's like, yeah, it can be kind of a conundrum, if I'm being honest. So, but we only got a little bit left. I want to hear what he's going to say in the rest about the timeline, because this is quite a bit of an interesting topic to talk about.
which means the only real Trunks, the only original Trunks we were ever introduced to was in the flashback scene in which Cell, the original Cell from the original timeline, killed off. So, Cell is the only character in that case that actually is from the true timeline that we had followed according.
No. This is where he got it wrong. He is going based off of the logic of the butterfly effect, where if you go back in the past, it changes the future or whatever. He's basically saying that Trunks is the same. This is what I'm saying is a plot hole, and I don't think he took this into consideration. I took this as a plot hole, but that Cell should not exist. It should only happen after the events of this Trunks has transpired. Because remember, he didn't kill, Trunks that was before there, because when he came there before there, 17 and 18 were still around. The one that he killed were the ones that he got the button and stopped them and destroyed them. So that was a completely different Trunks than this one. This Trunks had one where there was still a timeline. So he's confusing, saying, well, there's two different Trunks that came to them. There's the one that came from that timeline who gave them the first warning and then went back, and then he got killed by him, and then he came back 3 years in the past, and then there's this one who went, who came back there too. But that's not how it works. You're going based off the butterfly effect now. What really happened is he went back to his past. Nothing really happened. Nothing transpired. He came back to help them. And then for some reason, another timeline magically appeared where, there was even further in the future. But that doesn't exist unless you go back in time. So that is a plot hole. So I think at this part, his logic is incorrect. That's the way I'm seeing it. And, if Laughing Stock Media sees this video, I am a smaller YouTube channel, so you probably won't. You guys could probably send it to him. This is not to throw any shade at him. It's just to, critique his analysis. I think analysis there is wrong. I don't think there's two different ones. I think Toriyama messed up and made a very, very big logical error, because the only way these other timelines can create is if you go through, time again. And that would have made sense if, let's say if Trunks went to the future or something like that, but he didn't. So how would that Trunks work like that? Because that's going based off of like I said, the butterfly effect, where let's say he went back in time, whatever effect happened back in time would change the future, and then they would have been wiped out. That's how it happened. But that's not the case. So no, there's not two Trunkses from two separate timelines that came there to warn him. It was one. And for some reason, Toriyama set another, Trunks in the far future where he defeated them. And it wasn't even which he would have defeated them if Cell didn't interfere, but Cell shouldn't have came through there. So yeah, it's just wrong. It gets confusing, but just know that it's not just confusing because it's complex. It's confusing because it's wrong and it doesn't make any sense. So that's the only critique I'll have on Laughing Stock Media on this video. I don't agree with that sentiment. Hopefully, we can have a conversation, because I do admire his videos. I've watched his videos for years now, so I do like his content and his work, though I do think sometimes he can get some information incorrect, like this one.
This theory up until that point. The combination of the cells from the original characters who are eventually defeated by the duplicates, the variants with Goku, and then, of course, Gohan is the one who actually defeated him, and then Cell was defeated in the future Trunks timeline as a different variant of Cell then and there. Hopefully I didn't just blow your guys' minds and leave them all over the floor around you so you have to pick them up, but nonetheless, the point of the matter is that this is what the theory proposes, which does kind of significantly impact a lot of how we could view this story. That every character that we knew and loved actually had their real ending in the Frieza arc, and then everything afterward is following other characters. And people have also proposed this idea possibly for Dragon Ball Super, that perhaps in Dragon Ball Super, that's the reason why there are so many inconsistencies, so many plot holes potentially, so many differences between the manga version and then the actual version that we get in Dragon Ball Super, because it's actually a different timeline, and maybe the narrative once again shifted, and this time, who knows, maybe it takes place in the unseen timeline, or, maybe another timeline created altogether, because after all, we do know in the Dragon Ball manga, the Super one at least, that there was a time traveler in Universe 12. We don't know when that happened, so maybe that's where Super came from. Maybe in the manga version, it really was 10 years of peace, and then everything led off into a different direction.
Okay, that's one thing I don't like about Dragon Ball fans. They can put the headcanon and then they create these other stories. So yes, there is. I do agree with this not being the main timeline, but saying that oh maybe the manga is different. We all know why the manga is and the anime are different. It's basically Toriyama wanted these two writing staffs. Toyotaro, and then you have Toei Animation doing their own thing, and it just makes it a little more fun and creative. It's nothing to do with, oh, this is a different timeline that is set up that. I highly doubt this is going through Toriyama's mind or the writing staff, so I don't really like when people try to use their headcanon to, adjust the story narrative to their liking, because the inconsistencies is just bad writing and Toriyama's forgetfulness. I mean, the guy forgot that there was 3 Super Saiyan transformations and thought the Super Saiyan 2 transformation looked like Super Saiyan 3. He forgot launch. He forgot many things. I think Toriyama, when it comes to his knowledge on Dragon Ball, it's lacking compared to us fans. Us fans know more about, his writing than he does. I mean, the whole S-Cells thing, that is not how it works at all in Dragon Ball, and it contradicts his former statements. I would go more with his former statements when he was, on his grind consistently writing it, than on his newer statements where he is kind of, he had been out of it for quite a while, and he's far more forgetful due to, older age. Yeah, I don't agree with that sentiment right there. I'm forgetting a little bit. What did he mention before that? Oh yeah, he's saying that in the manga it says that there's a guy from Universe 12 that did it. In the anime, they don't mention specifically another person doing it, but they do state, I think they do state that somebody else, there are other people that have messed with time, and those other cases, those other drawers that was going endlessly throughout the entire hallway also had these other timeline rings, the green ones in it. So no, it's a little different. In the Super one, at the manga, they specifically stated a person from Universe 12, and the anime didn't say specifically a person, but there were countless, and I mean countless, like hundreds of to thousands of, different other timelines shown through that box representation throughout there. So they both still followed the rules of, countless other timelines there. The only difference is in the Super manga, they specifically say somebody in Universe 12 did it, whereas in the anime, they left it a little bit more ambiguous on who did it. So I don't think they're that completely different, but I'm not going to say the different manga and the anime are different because of that writing narrative. And I will also want to say that that the inconsistencies are there because of that either. I just think it's, Toriyama's forgetfulness.
Maybe even into GT. But in Dragon Ball Super, maybe it shifted timelines again. Maybe it did shift timelines for Dragon Ball GT. And that's all a way of explaining in-universe and out why everything is different. So this one theory could potentially kind of change up or give you guys some kind of headcanon to explain away a lot of those things in and out of universe. But what do you guys think? Do you think that Dragon Ball actually switched timelines during the future Trunks storyline of Dragon Ball Z? Or do you think that perhaps this is just a theory that itself might actually not have much weight to it? Overall, I do feel like if this...
So that was Laughingstock Media's video on did Dragon Ball Z switch timelines. I do agree that it did, but I disagree with the whole sentiment about, the one where Trunks got killed off. I do think that that is a plot hole and plot inconsistency. So I'll still go with future Trunks' timeline as the the main one, and that one's some weird departure for whatever reason. But I don't agree with the the argument of the headcanon saying that this is why the manga is different. That it really, in the end of the day, you can't say it is the case unless the writer says it. Until the writer says it, then we can agree. But I think at this point, those effects are just happening because Toriyama's bad, comprehension skills, and those other two is just because he left it to two different working heads. One is Toyotaro and the other one's the Toei Animation Company to deal with it as like a fun thing, but personally I do like, because then it's like, well, if you don't like the anime you could probably pick the manga, and if you don't like the manga you can pick the anime, so that you have different stuff and it makes it a little more unique than the other way. Also, you don't have to wait to catch up to the manga, because the manga and the anime don't need to be simultaneously connected to each other time wise. But I hate the time traveling thing. Is very confusing. I was a little confused here and there too. He was kind of definitely too, and I know a lot of you guys are. It can be getting really confusing at times, so I would just avoid it completely. But I do think it's still quite an interesting topic to talk about. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and stay tuned for next time.